Brett McKay here, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. Depending on how you look at things, us men either have it really made or we got the raw end in life. Most heads of state, CEOs, and famous inventors have happened to be men, and for millennia, men have enjoyed higher economic and social status than women. Yet, at the same time, men are the primary occupants in prisons, they make up 93% of all deaths on the job, and an overwhelming majority of homeless people are men. Why the extremes? Well, our guest today has recently written a book where he answers that question. His name is Dr. Roy Baumeister, and his book is called Is There Anything Good About Men? Dr. Baumeister is a professor of psychology at Florida State University, where he focuses on the area of social psychology. And he's authored over 500 publications and has written or co-written over 30 books. Okay, Professor Baumeister, one of the biggest issues you tackle in your book, Is There Anything Good About Men, is why men have for millennia held higher positions in society than women. And I think we've all heard different explanations for this throughout the past decades. But what conclusion did you come to in your book?
Well, Brett, I was trying to take a fresh look at things without saying that one gender is good or is better than the other, things like that. The answer for most of history of why men were in charge is that men were better than women, and that's the way it was supposed to be or the way it would inevitably be. More recently, we rebelled against this, and then the feminist movement brought up another explanation, said it was because evil men conspired to oppress women and push them down. But I don't think there's much evidence for either of those explanations, either that men are superior overall or that men are evil conspirators oppressing women. Instead, I look at the origins in the social relations, in the way men and women relate to other men and women. Essentially, women rather specialize in close, intimate relationships, whereas men tend to favor larger networks of more shallow relationships. And it just so happens that culture, which involves large systems of sharing information across groups and multiple roles complementing each other, things like that. Culture emerges better with the large network than the small network. And so back when men and women had separate spheres, I think the male network created more progress in the sense of gradually producing these things through the shared knowledge. And we're talking about literature, science, technology, or government, political, economic systems, and so on. And so essentially wealth, knowledge, and power were created in the men's sphere. And it wasn't true that women were pushed down as the feminist would have it. Rather, if anything, women were lifted somewhat by the men's progress, but not as fast, and the discrepancy increased because, again, wealth, knowledge, and power essentially created in the men's sphere. And again, not because men are better or superior or anything like that. It's just because of the kind of social relationships that men create, these larger networks of shallow relationships. That works better for creating the engines of growth like this.
Yeah, one of the interesting examples you gave of women tending to prefer one-to-one relationships and men preferring kind of shallow, large relationships I thought was very interesting. It stood out to me was that men are more likely to pick a fight with a random stranger in a bar. A woman would never do that, but a woman is more likely to start a fight with her spouse or her partner that she lives, in close contact with.
Yes, if you look at the people are aggressive toward people whose opinions they care about, and so on. And if you look within the family, statistically, it's very close to equal. Technically, if you want to really tally it up, women are slightly more aggressive and violent in the family than men, although they don't do as much damage since they're hit us quite as hard and things like that. In terms of violence between husbands and wives, women do more than men. That's been well established now through plenty of investigations. Women do more child abuse also, but they spend so much time with children it's hard to untangle. But out among the broader sphere of strangers, women don't do it. The chances, say, of a woman going out to the shopping mall and ending up in a knife fight with another woman that she's never met are minuscule. But to a certain number of men, probably every day, some men end up in fights and injurious or deadly with people they hadn't met before, because men care about their position more in the larger group. And the parallel results are found with helping, too. The early psychology of helping research consistently concluded, just as men were more aggressive, that men were also more helpful than others. But they always studied stranger interactions, who will stop and help a stranger or come to a stranger's aid in an emergency or something like that. So men was looking at this larger sphere there. If you look, again, in the family, in the network of close relationships, women are plenty helpful, if anything, more helpful than men in terms of taking care of family members or sick relatives, in-laws, and so on. So women are plenty helpful. It's just a narrower focus of the strongest motivations. Women mainly care about the ones they have the close, strong relationships. It's why the relationships researchers tell couples, well, the husband, you should listen to your wife. She's probably the expert on close relationships, more likely than the man. But in terms of building, again, large networks of the shallower relationships, that's something men do much more than women. We see in starting businesses as well. Women start more businesses than men in the United States today, but mainly small business. If you look at businesses that employ a few people or make enough to live on and so on, then men start more of these. So everyone can start them, but the men are more interested in building it up into a giant concern or an empire.
Well, you mentioned in the beginning that when you wrote this book, you want to take a fresh approach. You didn't want to say that one gender is better than the other. And you actually, in your book, you talk about how studies have shown that men and women are pretty much equally capable of in a lot of areas, in the sciences and the math. I mean, a man might be on the average do perform better in math and sciences, but the difference is so negligible that there really isn't much of a difference. And you argue that the difference maker is not capability but motivation. That men are more motivated to excel in business sphere in larger society than women are. So why do men have this motivation and women don't?
Well, why they have the motivation is hard to say. My guess is there's something that's just genetic. A lot of women, I know many fine women scientists, but they're more interested in living things. One I was talking to the other day, and she says she and her husband both scientists, and they're interested in everything. But when it comes to science on inanimate objects, study of things, she just loses interest. She says she calls it the dead world, and says, I leave the dead world to him. Life and living things just seem to capture women's interests more, and more interested in people. I mean, we've seen in the last 30, 40 years a huge influx of women into the upper ranks of researchers and professors and everything, but not equally in all fields. And it's not that the fields aren't receptive, it's just that women are much less interested in some. Larry Summers was president of Harvard and made some remarks about being attacked at one point about how come there's so few women physics professors at Harvard. And he said, I got into a lot of trouble for suggesting there might be ability differences. Well, the average man and the average woman have about equal ability. There are more men at both extremes, both the genius and the retarded. So in him suggesting there might be more men at the super high level, that's probably true, probably for biological reasons, just as the same as there are more men and women at the super retarded, very low intelligence level. Nature just seems to gamble a little bit more with the male than with the female. But even those differences are not so huge as to account for it. I think the bigger difference is that women are capable of doing just fine in these fields. They're just not as interested in it. Several scholars have spent decades studying this, tracking the kids through school and so forth. And it's not that the girls sign up for math and science classes and flunk out. No, that's not true at all. They just, if they have electives, they don't sign up. They'll take biology rather than physics if they have the choice. And so the study of things, who are the engineers, the technologists, the people who build things, and so on. It's much more men than women, and I think it reflects interest and desire. And I think the point of putting it that it's a matter of motivation, interest, desire rather than ability, that's an important and very positive message, because it means there's no basis for discriminating. If we thought that, say, men were really inherently better at these things than women, then an employer might say, you get an application from a woman and say, well, maybe I don't want to hire her because she's a woman, she's probably not as good at it. But no, I'm saying at least the abilities are basically equal. It's the differences that show up in the world are mainly because of what people like and want to do. And so if a woman's wanting to do something, you can assume that she's probably just as qualified as the man or just as capable as the man. There's not likely to be any deficit in the ability to do their job. So let people do what they want, and we shouldn't try to force people into or out of fields that they're not interested in simply to match some arbitrary notion of social engineering.
And it's interesting you brought up the Larry Sumner's thing. Just last week, or after I finished your book, I was reading a popular tech blog on the web called TechCrunch, and the author Michael Arrington, he's really big in the tech world, and he gets a lot of complaints from people that that he doesn't feature enough women startups, or whenever he has these big conferences, he doesn't have enough women speakers about featuring women startups that are started by women. And he said it's not that we're not trying. He says we just can't find them. And he made the point that we scour, but a lot of women just aren't interested in that. So it's hard to find women to speak or to feature them. Which I thought was kind of interesting, kind of serendipitous that I read this article right after I read your book.
Yes, I suspect that he's quite right about that. And in fact, I would guess that a woman startup technology company would get more attention than a man one, or would be more likely to be covered there, because there are all these efforts to, let's make sure to encourage women as much as they can. If the interest is not there, it isn't likely to happen. It doesn't seem that it's because of barriers that are keeping women out or anything like that.
So is this motivation in men and women, is it innate, or is it that's something that the culture teaches? For example, someone would hear this, okay, so men and women are just as capable, women just lack the motivation. Perhaps we should encourage women more and young girls to go into the science, so that's something that they are they'd like to do. I mean, can you change that, or is this something innate? I mean, what's going on there?
Okay, well, there are several different things. If it's innate, that does not mean it can't be changed. Nature usually sets some tendencies, and culture can either build on them, which it usually does, ignore them and leave them as they are, or it can try to counteract them. In general in our society, I think we are trying to counteract it. So our cultural effort is to shrink the differences between men and women, whereas through most of history, it is just taken it as they are and then tried to build on them. It used to be what might be somewhat in different inclinations between boys and girls became completely different life paths, and neither could do what the other wanted. And now we are trying very hard to encourage and pressure and browbeat men to get more involved in the traditional female activities of raising children, things like that, and trying to get women into science and technology and everything. But getting back to your question of whether it's innate, we don't know the answer to that. The people who've studied it seem repeatedly to come to the conclusion that it looks like it's innate. It certainly starts very early. Like I said, the people who say the women who do go into these science classes in college, they don't usually report that, they didn't want me there or they were pressuring me out. Often they report that they received very positive, encouraging treatment. It doesn't seem like they're being prevented there. Now, I don't know for sure if somehow they're getting a message early in childhood that is altering patterns of motivation, and that's hard to know and hard to rule out. But it seems the way we've been policing all the materials for children for a couple decades now, it seems very unlikely that there are strong messages discouraging girls from going into things. I can't really answer the question of whether it's innate. Which class you take in college and what you choose to do with your career is not determined by your genes, but genes may start you on a path and may make some things more rewarding to you, and then you seek out experiences and things will snowball along the way. Mm-hmm. So it is possible. Certainly we could pressure all men to leave science and then only gave science jobs to women and forced women to take them. Well, we would have more women doing science. Whether they would be happy and whether they would be as good at it and as successful at it and find it as rewarding as men do, well, probably not, given that people are being forced to do something.
So it's kind of up in the air, really. There's no conclusion.
Many of us have daughters, and we would like to see them go into science, and I think we encourage them all their lives in every way we can. And we certainly don't see them getting the message from elsewhere that they shouldn't go into science. But still, they seem, in many respects, not to want to do that, or eventually they find something else that seems more interesting to them. And of course, science is a big category, and there are lots of sciences that study living things, and the social sciences study people, and there are plenty of women in those, and many having outstanding careers. But for an interest in things and in small bits of non-living reality, they don't seem in general to capture the female imagination as much as the male.
All right. Well, so you argue in your book as well that there's a dark underbelly to the success or the enjoyment of status that men have had for the most part in the economic and social world. But there's also, so there's this dark underbelly, and that men are also seen as expendable by culture. Can you explain how culture exploits men in a negative fashion?
Yes. Well, that was one of the themes, one of the things that got started me on it is, I say the feminist critique of society looked up at the top and said, well, look at the president and the Congress and the CEOs of chief executives and the powerful, rich people around the world, and there are more men than women. And they thought, okay, well, it must be great to be a man. Society's set up to favor men. But a social scientist has to look at both sides. So if you look down at the bottom, you see mostly men, too. You see who's in prison, who's homeless, who's dead on the job, who's sent off to die in battle. Men are there, too. Latest statistic, deaths on the job in the United States, 93% men. So men are just doing many more dangerous jobs than women. And this is not unique to the United States. This is true pretty much all over the world. Societies tend to give bigger rewards and bigger punishments to males. There's simply a lot of jobs in a culture, a lot of positions that are more high risk, high reward. And so it's a matter of, would you take the risk for the higher reward? Certainly jobs that have the possibility of getting you killed have to pay a little extra, because otherwise who would take such a job as compared to another job? That's one of the things contributes to difference in the salaries between men and women, and we'll do more of these dangerous jobs. Now, society tends to shield women from doing these risky things that will get them killed or have their lives wasted or seriously injured in other ways, probably for rather simple biological reasons. Throughout most of history, most cultures, most societies were competing against others, and your very survival depended on being strong enough to stand up to your neighbors. And, well, the larger the group, the more successful you're going to be. Losing population and having too few of you to last or to maintain a competitive advantage, that was fatal to a society. And it's true. There's no question. Look at almost all societies in the history of the world. They've encouraged their people to have more children. More children are simply seen as better. They're better for the economy. They're better for the health of the society, and so forth. But the number of children you have depends on the number of women you have. And that's a simple fact of biology. Most women have at least one child, and it's hard for a woman to have more than about a dozen, whereas a single man certainly can have hundreds of children. There are reports of men having over 1,000 children. So if you lose a whole bunch of your men, say you have a big war and half of your men are killed, well, the next generation can still be full size. But if you lose half your women, your next generation is going to be significantly smaller in size. So for maintaining population and this increasing population, which again has been the goal of most societies, most cultures, most religions in the history of the world, not all, but most and certainly most successful ones, you want to make sure that most of your women stay alive, are able to reach adulthood and bear children, whereas, again, one man can go from woman to woman and have lots of different children in the same year, whereas a woman who goes from man to man still can only have about one child per year. So I think that's one reason. Another reason that society looks at men as expendable, it goes with the kind of social networks and groups that men create. The larger groups, people are replaceable in them. So if you look at a corporation or a military unit or an orchestra or whatever, a sports team, everyone in it gets replaced over time. But you look at the small relationships in a family, you can't really replace a child's mother. You can get another woman to do some of the work, but it's really a different family if the mother dies and another woman is brought in and so on. So women are cultivated by their style of social relations to understanding themselves as valuable and precious, and men more to see themselves as expendable. Turning to how society exploits men, it will, again, assign men the dangerous jobs, attract men into things with exploration, where a dozen people might go exploring and half of them get killed and some come back with nothing. But one or two every so often come back and have found something really wonderful, and that's something that will enrich the group. Well, then society gives those men a lot of rewards, but again, we're not looking or not attending to all the other men who lost out and maybe lost their lives in doing that. The same with fighting in battle. Somebody has to fight in battle against the enemies. These days, given the technology, certainly you don't need to be strong and husky or have the big shoulders or the few biological differences in physical powers between the strength. But still, there's a sense of wanting to protect women from that, and that somehow men are more expendable. Even on the Titanic, it was interesting to notice. I mean, there was a case where a ship was going down, and there were thousands of people aboard, and there weren't enough seats in the lifeboats, and they gave them to the women. The men, you might have thought, patriarchy should count for something, and the rich and successful men, but the rich and powerful men on there actually had a lower survival rate than the poorest level of women. So, all your wealth and power didn't do any good, even for saving your life. Under those circumstances, it was better to be a woman. And again, I think women and children, that society, our society, pretty much every society sees women and children as somehow more precious and more valuable than men. The phrase, even women and children were killed, which one still sees in the news every month or so. What that means is that, maybe it's bad if men are killed, but it's worse if women and children are killed, because women and children are more valuable than men.
Join us next time for part 2 of our interview with Dr. Roy Baumeister as we discuss his book, Is There Anything Good About Men? Until next time, stay manly.